Hey everybody, it's Brian Wilson here. I'm the co-instructor for the 2019 MIT Computational Law course workshop, and I'm joined by Juan Ramirez from Interoperable. And today we're going to be bringing you guys the part one of integrating interoperable apps and services with a legal platform. And so what we're looking to do some key concepts, and then from there get actual experience with kind of what it looks like to actually build these apps into and platform. So with that, Juan, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Brian. Well, welcome everybody. So this will be kind of a 101 chat or breakout session where we go over, we're going to focus on relativity, and we're going to talk a little bit about e-discovery and what it is. So I'm Juan Ramirez. I work with Interoperable. This is a company that develops applications on top of that platform, right, for the relativity space. So we're going to start off with just a basic introduction of e-discovery. We'll work into relativity, and then we'll go into building basically a no-code application within relativity. So we don't actually need code. We'll use their tools, and it's semi-functional application since we have some time restrictions. But this is something we can view. We'll say in the next course, right? And this afternoon there's another course, and we can extrapolate and build on what we started building and start showing you things that actually do require code. So to kick that off, I have some slides here. I'll just use them as reference, and we'll be kind of going back and forth. So bear with me as I switch over. All right. So I'm assuming most of you know what e-discovery is. If you don't, e-discovery is basically the handling of electronically stored information, right? Or ESI, as the industry calls it. And so this didn't exist in the past. This was, if you look at a black and white movie, this was when you'd have stacks of paper and you'd hire these associates to basically go through documentation and try to find what they call the smoking gun of a case. And at some point in 2006, I believe in December, the amendment to a civil procedure actually gave birth to e-discovery, right, where they actually said you can submit electronic information as evidence. And so that was basically the birth of e-discovery and all these companies that handle big data. It started off small, but people were either scanning things in. Now it's grown to basically, millions of documents to hundreds of millions of documents, whereas before, you'd have a stack of paper and you would review that. At this point, the industry is around $10 billion, and it just keeps growing. Within, 4 years, we will close to double. So this is something that is, is getting a lot of innovation just due to the financial initiative that it has behind it. So we're focusing today on relativity. And what is relativity? Well, relativity is one of like the dominant I guess providers of e-discovery, right? They focused at first, and I'll jump slides here. They focused at first. We're looking at an EDRM here of just this little blue piece of the EDRM, which is I ingest data, I review it, I analyze it, and then at some point it'll get produced, meaning I'll hand it over to the opposing counsel. They're starting to expand their coverage of all of this, which kind of makes them a preferred, basically, platform that we want to develop on. And so that's what we've been up to since 2011. We're a relatively small team. We started, obviously just one with me, hired the next guy, and for the last couple of years, we've been growing and evolving as a team. And the same thing with their platform, right? They started with some really janky and hard to use APIs, and now it's very modernized and it's very technology agnostic. They're based on .NET for the most part, but now that they use REST services, you can basically write software on anything, right? You can do it in just client scripting if you really needed to. So it's a pretty stable platform. It's growing. They're moving into a SaaS environment, so their data sets are growing. They're into like hundreds of millions of documents, or even billions at this point. So it's something that is growing. And they not only do review, they're forward thinking in the fact that we're building applications that really have nothing to do with review. but they have something to do with a specific case. So we've done things for different clients where, at a point somebody needed to visualize something in a pipeline that some oil company was purchasing, so they needed to see how that was going, all the purchases of these things. We've done, project management type applications, which in essence have to do with the case, but they don't necessarily have to do with just review. So it's expanding a lot, and their platform is really helping. And so with that, I'll talk about some of the success stories. I have some samples, but they have these innovation awards. The pipeline thing is one thing that was really outside the box, where it wasn't analysis or searches or some AI engine that searched for topics, but it was something that they thought out the box and they did it. But the same thing with a petition application, where they won like a $20 million case because we were able to identify a little bit of fraud from these petition guys. Which is kind of a funny business because they get paid per signature. And so we were able to identify that they started the signatures early, and that once we visualized what counties they were on, we were able to say that there was basically a person in two places at once. And so, when it came to the actual trial, the judge threw out the case, and it was like a $20 million case. So it was a really big deal. So the return on investment on customizing some of these things is really big for some of these law firms or some of these corporations. And that's basically why I exist as a company, and why Relativity is doing so well, just because of their coverage and how they're expanding their platform. Similar, I try to compare it to like Salesforce, where they're, I guess, a CRM, but you can do anything with it. And there's providers out there that are already worth, multi-billion-dollar companies that are writing software on top of Salesforce. So, I mean, we're not worth $1 billion, but at some point, hopefully, we will be. But for now, we'll stick to writing small case applications.
Yeah, and I think this gets at something very important that we've tried to hit on in the course, and that is that technology and design are allowing us to transition more from the law being law-centered, where it's just focused on regulations and statutes and how they apply to people, to being more human-centered, where it's focused on how people themselves interact with. So it's kind of this paradigm shift from one era where things happened one way to this new, more exciting era where they're designed actually for the people to make their lives a little bit easier and more intuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of a trend we're seeing, is smoothing out workflows, organizing things so it reduces the human error factor, and speeds up time. So a lot of firms are able to either bid on cases that they can win at because they're a lot more efficient now, or charge a premium because they're more accurate. So we're kind of tackling things, like you said, in the human factor, not necessarily 100% where everything's done automatically and you don't know what this thing's doing for you, but it is facilitating like their jobs.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Cool. All right. Well, I will share. I kind of want to go through a walkthrough of what Relativity is. I'm sure some of you have seen it, and some of you have not. So I kind of just want to give a 10-minute little overview of what it is. So I'm sharing a basic Relativity screen, which is when you log in, you see this little guy. And workspaces to them is analogous to a case. And so Relativity will have client will have cases, and cases could be subdivided into workspaces. Workspaces then have documents. And documents, if we look at the EDRM spectrum, this is after collection, right? So we've determined what documents we need, what custodians we need to kind of review documents for that are involved in whatever litigation we're in right now. We've processed all this, so we've kind of filtered out things. Maybe it's by date, so we've done some previous filtering, so we don't shove in hundreds of gigs, which we could, and then filter it within Relativity. But the idea is to kind of pre-select the data we want in there. So right now we're after processing, since we already have some documents in here. And Relativity is not known for their gorgeous AI. They're known for managing large data sets and having powerful search tools. And so you'll see this is very Excel. And so this provides an opportunity for us as well, to provide better UIs depending on what data you're working with. once you're in Relativity, the basic function is to basically go through documents and see if they're relevant or not. And so they go through different phases. They'll go through a first pass review, a second pass review, and what Relativity offers is additional metadata. And all these things that are called fields within the Relativity space are basically things that as a lit support person or a project manager for the case has added as items of information that we're either going to add in or have been identified to collect. And so we'll go through some basic ones here, which is, is this document hot or not, right? Is this responsive or not responsive? And for the most part, it started off in 2006 or 7 as a manual process. I'm going to read this email and basically, yes, this is responsive. Go to the next thing. This is like a logo. This is not responsive. And that's how it went. Nowadays, they have machine learning, which you start training it, and it knows what themes or context you're looking at. And so, you'll train it with a couple hundred documents, and it starts learning what the content of this is. So they are using a lot of machine learning here to save time, because data sets keep growing. Right? The average data set in 2007, I believe, was in the hundreds of thousands, so 200, 300,000. And now the average workspace has approximately 5 to 10 million. So to hire, the average review rate of manual review of reading a document is about, I would say, 40 documents an hour. So if you were to try to tackle a couple million, your expense of actually hiring review either associate attorneys or there's actually outsourcing of reviewers. So there's big companies out there that will outsource the review. So then you have some elasticity in your demand, whether you need a lot now and you don't need it later. So there is some outsourcing there. But regardless, their hourly rates aren't low. And so this is where they started implementing a lot of either early case assessment or machine learning, right? Trying to use a lot of this compute power to figure out how we can reduce the actual manual. So they'll do first pass maybe through machine learning, and then once the machine identifies things, they'll do some manual, I guess searching at that point or review at that point. And so it reduces it quite a bit, right? You can kind of get rid of more than half of the documents that you would have had to do manually to machine learning. And this is all, part of the Relativity training course that they go through. So it's not an easy onboarding with Relativity. There is a lot of pieces to it, and they keep expanding on it. They just keep this analysis piece is where they've added some NoSQL database. They started using Elasticsearch as their backend for really large pieces of text. And so they're able to do concept searches, and they run extremely quick compared to SQL, which is their main backend on like relative objects and things like that. And so that's kind of the gist of Relativity as a document review platform. And one of the things that Relativity is really good at is letting you expand its use. And what I mean by that is they have this concept of relativity dynamic objects, and they refer to them as RDOs. And what that is basically is allowing you to basically create a relational database by building entities. And so when we can compare it to a database, this would be the example I can give you here is creating a table. And if we align to a database, each field that we add to an item could be related to like a column, right? So what I want to go through here is a basic, I don't know, contact list application that we can use later on to kind of assign tasks to people and things like that. But this is kind of 101 for them, where even at this level with zero code, people have found it really useful, where they can just keep track of things, whether it's when a hard drive came in through the mail and they ingested it, or just keeping track of people involved in the case, whether it be a custodian. So they do a good job of giving you flexibility to create things without actually having to hire developers. So what I've done there is created a new object. I can create a new field, which would be analogous to a column in a data table. And this was contact. It comes with name, but I'll do first name. they have different field types. And so very similar to a database, which is, is this going to be long text, which is unlimited, like a blob, or fixed length text, which can go up to 4,000 characters. And then these are the other, what we saw before regarding review was considered a single choice because it's either, documents either hot or not. In our case, we're just going to do fixed length text for somebody's first name. And we'll just create, oh geez, cleared it out for me. And then we'll just keep creating the field that we need, last name.
And it's pretty, and as somebody who's worked with Relativity through a project that I had with the ABA Center for Innovation, I can speak a little bit to the ability to kind of customize cool things in Relativity workspaces. They allow you to generate kind of anything that you want. So we had a project where we were just looking at the most common features of wrongful conviction investigations, innocence projects across the Midwest, and so it was this is something that the only limit I think imagination, and if you figure out how you can kind of get your imagination to where it works in kind of this Excel sort of database model, there are a lot of really cool opportunities. I've really done a good job of highlighting and
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And so you worked on a case with them, Ryan?
So I was when I was a fellow with the ABA Center for Innovation, we kind of did this proof of concept and some other of their support staff to kind of produce our work with us, and can we produce a framework for reviewing documents that allows for distributed reporters where it can be done by people who have different permissions across several different locations, and then can we use that information to make some data-driven policy insights. And that was through their academic partnership program with Janice Holman, and that's actually how Juan and I got connected, for everybody who is here on the live stream.
Cool.
If Janice ever sees this video, thank you to Janice for making all of these connections.
Yeah, I think she's going to appreciate the shout out. So while Brian was giving us a little background, I went ahead and created a field called, I think, contact type. Oh yeah, there it is. And I added some choices to that. So now when I go and add or modify contacts, which we'll do right now, there like a single choice. And Relativity gives you, these are all what they call tabs, which is pretty self-explanatory. But then we get into things like layouts and views, right? And right in here, what we're supposed to see is a list of contacts once we start creating them. They give you the flexibility. If you have 1,000 views or 1,000 fields, you don't want to see the whole thing. So then you can kind of focus on what you want to look at regarding what is available. If you have 1,000 fields in a document, you don't want to see the whole thing. So it's kind of like in Excel where you want to filter through a couple of them. You don't want to see everything, so that's what they do here. And so I'll add the ones I added since they're pretty much all relevant to what our example is here. And so now our little grid will update. Automatically has filters and things like that. So if I had a list of contacts that I had created, it automatically allows me to filter by the possible values that are available. And so these are views. When you go into layouts, layouts is basically the field that they want available to users when you're editing or adding new items. And so let's go ahead and edit this layout because by default, it's only giving me the name field, which is pretty useless to me. So I kind of want to go first name, last name, email. Let's leave name in there since it might be mandatory, and contact type. And so we added someone here. It could be like Joe Smith. It's J Smith. I don't know. And the choices I have here, I'll just say he's an employee. And so he starts popping up. And now that I'm in my list, if I had 1,000, he'd start showing up here. And name is not relevant to me since I'm never gonna use it. I could modify it to full name. At this point, if I really wanted to, I could create an event handler that would basically format last name, comma, first name, and add it in the full name field automatically without me having to populate it. So they have different pieces of the API that allows you to basically automate all these things. Right now, they're based on the .NET framework, which is, we use C# for everything regarding, and it's a DLL that you would import this thing to tie it. And as soon as you would hit save, it would populate this full name field, or we would rename it to full name. But that applies to everything. You can automate a document to say, if I do this value, then populate this other value, or if this value is set, make sure this other value is not empty, so prevent it from being saved. So I mean, getting back to the contact, event handlers would be a way to basically, without adding an interface, create rules that people can use to keep some data consistency and not kind of create this database where there are duplicates, or in this particular case, it's a contact, so you could easily identify it is just by sorting and things like that. But you could create an event handler that said, hey, there's already a Joe Smith in here. Are you sure it's not the same person? So they have coverage of the API just about everywhere in Relativity. What I want to do here is that in this contact doesn't really have a ton of information, so I wanted to add an address. So to do that, I was going to create a new object type just called like address, and then I'll show you how we would associate it basically to the contact object, and allows us to have more than one address per, because we could have added address, city, zip to that one person, but he's going to have a home address, he's going to have an office address. So this is a way that Relativity kind of grows very quickly, where you start associating one thing to another. And it makes it really easy, without being a DBA, to really create something useful.
Yeah, and I think that ability to kind of connect things that in this lecture, especially where we're trying to figure out if we've got one single source of data, from that data in order to make together so that they themselves can start coming up with new ideas about make it, start putting these things together, things that themselves make to do. Maybe they come up with a new idea for, an app or a service that they actually don't know that they need until now. And so I think that sessions like this are valuable in that way.
Yeah, and yeah, I think the flexibility, creates a little bit of complexity because people need to kind of learn, but it's not that difficult. And people really have created very extensive applications using just this framework, right? Just the relational database type of concept. So in this particular case, I'm creating probably the most interesting one that we haven't done, and this is single object, which is where I'm going to associate it to our contact. And so if this was a database term, this is where I did a join between the two tables, right? I'm doing basically a join between the contact and the address. So we'll have to go and do the same thing we did for contact, where now we did new contact. We still don't see address, so we'll go back and change the layout. Actually, no, it's not here. I didn't open to association, but now we have the address, and we can do the same thing here. So let me go ahead and modify that. Well, let's add a new one. I'll modify the layout so you can see how I can create a new address and associate someone to it. So address, same thing, city, state, and related contact. This will be the interesting little piece here. So here's related contact. Did we add one? Yeah. Every time you're live, something happens. That's all right. We added Joe Smith, so we'll say his brother John.
That's good.
And he's a contractor. Oh, I'll tell you why. Because the descriptive field is empty, and we can change that in a little bit. I'll show you what I did here. Meaning that very first name that we didn't populate is what they're using as kind of a description. So we actually have two items here with an empty name. We'll fix that in a little bit. So this is address. We'll say, this is my home address. Why not? And so we didn't add anything for state. We made it a single choice because we didn't want people typing things out. We can go ahead and take like the whole repository of states, but we'll just stick to like a couple here. Yeah, let's say Wisconsin. Cool. So we've added a new address here. We can't tell what it is since we haven't modified the actual view yet. And so this is a full-fledged address now. And to actually see how this relates, I think we can go back. Oh no, I didn't add the contact. But the gist of this, while I'm kind of creating these adjustments, is that we've basically created like a little application that can host all these contacts in there, and created basically the form to add them. Right, this is like a form creator, whether you've used like a SurveyMonkey or any kind of like Google Forms to send out for gathering information. It's basically the same thing, right? What information do I want to gather and collect and store, and how do I want the form to look like? So we've done all that in the gist of maybe what, 10 minutes, which is, in DBA terms, it would have taken a while. It would have required me to talk to either my DBA, and then my DBA is gonna ask me about primary keys and things like that. And he's going to take a while to do it, and whether he's internal or not, we might have to pay for that. And then I have to talk to a web developer to actually give me a form, like an HTML page that I can actually gather this data in. If we're not using any of like the Google tools or other like form and data gathering tools that are out there. And so we did this in 5-10 minutes. The UI isn't the most beautiful, right? It's very Excel looking and very table looking. But this is kind of where we'll go in the session that's after this and see how we can take some of this data and visualize it in a way that, one, it's not boring, and two, it makes it maybe a little easier to do some data entry, because now we don't have to go to 2 pages or 2 places to update data. And so that's kind of like the next session. We'll show some examples of what we've done to visualize some data that's stored within Relativity as RDOs or as field data.
That's awesome, and I think this kind of highlights, the beauty of what Relativity and what allows you to do, and that is, you can create a playground instead of something that is very clunky and very heavy. So instead of having to focus on all of those kind of mundane steps with configuring the database, so if the database administration steps, you're just able to go in and say, hey, I know I'm going to need these features for this object, And in order to create that, have that cranked out, and it's really exciting for somebody who's spent a lot of time looking at data, because data doesn't just happen. You have to an object to 5 to come, or it to be to deliver comp that you want on top of that, in order to kind of get to the ultimate outcome that you want to that you want to be at.
Right. No, and I think ease of
So
use
with that,
is their success. And there are tools out there that allow you to do similar things. But I think people are using this within Relativity to associate it, whether it's case management or tracking where documents are at. It's usually associated to something to do with their case. And so the tools that are out there, yes, they're great. They probably have better interfaces and things like that to store data because that's their core focus. But in this particular case, if you wanted to do something like that in a separate application, you would have to either have 2 accounts in 2 different places, or find a way, to right now a bridge between the 2 apps. So the beauty of this is that you can do it within the system and potentially reutilize the data that's already stored within Relativity.
Yeah, and to that end, we talked a little bit in the session about different types of APIs that you could use to connect with the data and all of those objects, and then make them into something else. One of the comments that we had in the pigeonhole session was, could you just explain very quickly about what APIs there are? So like what's an API or a face, and how in order to get to these outcomes that we've talked about.
Yeah, good point. So basically, they have all kinds of APIs. They all have very similar structures, right? So if you programmed in REST or if you programmed in .NET, it's some sort of object that has methods, has properties, things like that. And so the most basic one is what we just looked at, which I don't think they consider an API. They consider it just a way to build applications. The most basic one might be an event handler, which we talked about, which is basically a library drop, or in our case, a DLL drop that associates to the object, and you can do all kinds of behavior with it. You say, whenever I mark something responsive, send an email to the partner attorney to make sure that he's getting notified when all the very responsive documents are being identified within the case. Or you can use it for data consistency, right? If I, for some reason, have a sent date of, I don't know, in the future. So whenever I'm modifying a document, I can do some data consistency that says, this data is not right. It can take all kinds of actions. It can be a trickle effect. A lot of things that we get is, if I set this to this, then do this, this, and that, right? So they kind of align to how they want to see it. And that's the event handlers. You kind of could move up from there and consider agents to be the next step. And agents is basically a service. In Windows, it could be just a Windows service, or I'm trying to give an analogy. In Linux, Apple, like a daemon. And so what these things will do is just run on an interval, and you tell it all kinds of things. You could say, give me a report of how many people are logged in. You could say, clean this up because this was temporary data. So agents are very useful when it's an iterative process, or you want things automatically done without human interaction. On top of that would be what they call their Kepler services, which we'll go into probably not today, but tomorrow. Maybe we'll touch on it today. But basically, Kepler is a way to reach all the RDOs, all the document, all the backend data. You can use REST to get to it. So you can query the new contact object that we said. We could say, contact number, ID number, this, and that. I want to know all their information. And once you have their information, you can, post it to you can use an agent to basically send constant emails to these guys, or it's a basic way to read and write what's in the repository. And probably a big piece of what we do is, we do a mix of things, right? There's always, every solution has probably bits of the API that we have to use. Custom pages is probably the biggest one, which is the ability to inject HTML into Relativity. So you can create something that has really pretty reports or really intuitive interface. Something we'll see later this afternoon is visualizing things in Google Maps or a Google Calendar, or a way to drag and drop tasks. So really giving it a more modern feel and ease of use to something that, for example, the contacts. We're gonna later on in this afternoon session, we'll add like tasks. And so you can assign a task to a contact, and then instead of going to a task and updating its progress, you can just drag and drop it to the different states of where it can be. The other piece is that they're working on right now, or that they have established, is their import API, which is a way to consume mass pieces of data. I mean, it could be a bit of data, or it could be millions. And so the import API is basically a way just to get data into Relativity. And they've expanded that to what they call RIP, which is Relativity Integration Points. And we've created RIP for Google Drive, to OneDrive, to Amazon Storage. So it's an easy way for something automatic to go and either pull for something and ingest it, or the other way around, to export it as well. So they basically have the whole thing covered, right? You want to get data in, you can. You want to visualize it differently, you can. You want something automatic to happen based on a certain piece of information that you set, a document, you can. So they really expanded to basically anything you can do. And if they don't have the coverage, you can go into the wild and just go direct repository. They don't recommend it, but you can go Wild West on it and really go straight to the data tables.
And that gets to one of the questions that one of the students had about, similar programs. And what's, I think, the most exciting part about this is Relativity's kind of turned itself into almost like an app store for anything that's related to the installation of pieces fits. You can see that optimizing legal workflows in the future.
Yeah. So with the APIs provided, you could tie it to anything, right? It really is. Hopefully, whatever you're integrating with
ways that you
as well. So then, we've built bridges to a billing application that's very specific to law firms, right? Where they log in their hours, and that's what they're going to use to invoice their clients. And so we've tied those applications into Relativity, and so it does lend itself to tie into basically any industry standard application. And that's something we'll look at tomorrow, how to use collaboration tools. So we'll write a quick application to integrate to Slack, for example, and Slack can query objects that are in there and see what a document's doing, or how a task is progressing. So yeah, there is definitely ability to tie into other industry standard software. And I don't know if it's me, but Brian, you look frozen. Right, Brian? I don't know if I'm frozen or Brian's frozen. All right, I think we're waiting for Brian to rejoin. In the meantime, I do see more questions regarding SQL and its benefits. Is it faster? So Relativity has, and hopefully you guys can hear me, Relativity has implemented multiple databases, right? They have a really solid relational database with SQL. but they also know that their data sets are getting larger and larger. So SQL at some point just is going to be memory intensive. And so what they've done is certain pieces of relativity use Elasticsearch, which is based on the Lucene engine. And it's incredibly fast, and it's very good at text searching. And so that's where they get a lot of their speed, where basic functions are handled in SQL, and a lot of like the mass operations and big data handling is done in a NoSQL database. Daza asked what kind of APIs there are. There's both, right? There's .NET Framework type API, and there's also REST API, and usually you get both coverage. If you're writing a non.NET application, you can consume it in using all the REST API, or I mean, you can even write as a client scripting or a client code application that has zero compilation, and you can basically use Notepad or any text editor to write a full functional application, since there's no server code running besides the REST services. So yeah, there's both.